Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to Schuler Auditorium. Before we start, we ask that you please turn your ringers to your cell phones and pagers off at this time. Thank you. We now continue our journey in search of personal freedoms. Today's topic, the Civil War, Emancipation Proclamation, and the Civil War Amendments. Would you please welcome to the stage William Lloyd Garrison and John C. Calhoun. And now our first speaker, William Lloyd Garrison.
Well, thank you for inviting me on this very glorious 4th of July morning of 1829. I am William Lloyd Garrison, editor of that immortal periodical, The Liberator, more responsible for the abolition of slavery than any other person or journal. I am a man of the 19th century whose philosophies and values far transcend those of the last century and, from all indications, thus far, the current century. I am all on fire, and I have mountains of ice to melt. 53 years ago, the 4th of July was a proud day for our country. It very clearly and accurately defined the rights of man. It made no vulgar alterations in the usages of society, and it vindicated the omnipotence of public opinion over kingly government. It shook us with a great voice, as an earthquake, the thrones that had been seemingly upheld by Atlantean pillars, and it gave impulse to a world which yet thrills to its extremities. But I speak as no partisan of any man or measure when I say that our politics are rotten to the core. We boast of our freedoms who go shackled to the polls by tens, by hundreds, by thousands. We abuse our liberties by withdrawing from the polls or going to them as a matter of form without investigating the merits of a single candidate. But there is another catastrophe, and it should make this day a day of fasting and prayer rather than of pageantry and joy and merriment. We should strike every cannon and haul down every banner. Our garb should be sackcloth, our heads bowed in the dust, our supplications for pardon and the assistance of heaven. I am not here to tell you that slavery is a curse, debasing in its effect, cruel in its punishment, fatal in its continuance. I do not claim the discovery of my own, that all men are born equal and among their inalienable rights to our life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Our government has shamelessly enforced the evil practice of slavery with the Constitution and with legislative edicts that allow the slaveholders to deprive the slaves of the holy word of God and the grace of all His comfort. They deny any manner of simple education to the slave that would allow him the basic skills to enjoy the smallest fruits of all his labor. And here, let me ask, what has Christianity done for our slave population? Comparatively, nothing. She can gaze without emotion upon a multitude of miserable human beings, large enough to constitute a huge nation of free men. In her services, they are seldom remembered. In her donations, they are forgotten. Her charitable societies, from one end of the country to the other, have nothing but golden means, but they do not bring sustenance to the slave. Their blood is upon her garments, but she heeds not the stain. Their clanking of their chains strikes her ear, but they do not penetrate her heart. I must say that such a glaring contradiction exists between our creed and practice. The annals of 6,000 years of history cannot parallel. I am ashamed of my country. I am sick of our unmeaning praise of liberty and equality and our hypocritical cant about the rights of man. I am aware that many object to the severity of my language, but is there not a cause for severity? I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. I do not wish to think or speak or write in moderation. Do not ask me to be moderate in a cause like the present. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not yield a single inch, and I will be heard. There is much declamation about the compact that was formed between the free and slave states on the adoption of the Constitution. A sacred document, forsooth. Such a compact was null and void from the beginning. No body of men had the right to guarantee the holding of human beings in bondage. Who or what were the framers of our government that they had the right to confirm and authorize such high-handed villainy, such flagrant robbery of the inalienable rights of man, such a glaring violation of all the precepts and injunctions of the gospel, such a savage war upon a sixth part of our whole population? They were men like ourselves, as weak, as fallible, as sinful as ourselves. By their infamous bargain they made among themselves, they virtually dethroned the Most High God and trampled beneath their feet their own solemn and heaven-attested declaration that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. A sacred compact. A sacred compact. What then is wicked and ignominious? People of New England and the Free States, is it true that slavery is no concern of yours? Have you no right to protest against it or to seek its removal? Are you not the main pillars of its support? It is said if you agitate this question, you will divide the Union. Believe it not. Should this Union follow, the fault will not be yours. You must perform your duty faithfully and fearlessly and promptly and leave the consequences to God. And that duty is to stop giving countenance and protection to Southern kidnappers. Be assured that slavery will destroy the Union if it be let alone. But even if the Union should be preserved by trampling on the necks and spilling the blood and destroying the souls of millions of your race, we say the risk is not worth the price like this, and it is in the highest degree criminal of you to continue the present compact. A group of congressional leaders have conspired to establish and protect and make safe the insidious and evil and profane system of slavery by passing such diabolical measures as the gag rule, the 3/5 clause, and by reinforcing the fugitive slave law. Among a half a dozen men in Congress, the utterance of whose sentiments in times of great deep excitement command the national attention and exert in all sections of the country a strong influence over the popular mind for good or for evil, Mr. John Calhoun stands prominent. He has no breadth of character, no greatness of spirit, no generosity of purpose, no comprehensiveness of view. No man has ever been more sectional in his feelings or aims for the country. In no aspect does he present an American front. He is a Southern man as against the North. The welfare of the South, not of the whole American Republic, is the object of his solicitude. The extension and perpetuity of slavery, not the preservation and extension of liberty, is the end of all his labors. Intellectually, it is universally conceded that Mr. Calhoun is much above mediocrity. But a great mind, miserably perverted, is neither an object of admiration nor creditable to its possessor, and is certainly a calamity to the race. The real dimensions of a man are the size of his heart, not the volume of his brain. But who knows what or where is the heart of John Calhoun? Who has felt its warmth? Who can attest to its pulsation? Who knows that it has any vitality? He has no blood. He is as cold as a corpse. He is a man of iron, not of flesh. He is hybridous and not natural. He is demonized by a passion and a principle that destroys all human affinity and undermines every foundation of morality. He believes and acts in accordance with the belief that it is better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. Washington, Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, all distinguished men of the South, invariably deplored slavery's existence as evil and contemplated its gradual but certain and eventual extirpation. But Mr. Calhoun, in utter disregard of the testimonies of these great men, and in contempt of the self-evident truths of the Declaration of Independence, defiance of the sentiments of the rest of the world, which is still probably low in its estimate of human liberty, and in violence of his natural instincts, still believes that slavery is a blessing, the noblest of all institutions, the source of national prosperity, the cornerstone of the temple of republican freedom. He is resolved to bequeath it to posterity as the richest legacy that can ever be given. If his brain is not diseased to an extent that it destroys all accountability, he is to be judged as the wickedest of men. He is to be ranked as a criminal of no ordinary dye. He goes for the enslavement of millions and their posterity to the end of time, and whatever that bondage requires: whippings, chains, torture, extreme penal laws. He is destitute of virtue, for he denies to these millions the marriage contract and enforces prostitution. He is without natural affection, and he is in favor of wholesale and retail dealing in human flesh, and sells the babes from their mothers as naturally as he would the progeny of swine. He is fraudulent to the highest degree. His proper place, if he is diseased on this subject to an insane degree, then he belongs in an insane asylum and not in the Senate of the United States. But that excuse is not to be greatly urged. Therefore, in a right moral estimate, Mr. Calhoun is deserving of the condemnation we have bestowed upon him. The raid at Harper's Ferry in October of 1859, led by Captain John Brown, and his ensuing trial and execution in December of the same year, is an example and a terrible reminder of the ugly and frightening violence that will always result from the continuance of slavery. A word about the subject of peace. I am a non-resistant, a believer in the inviolability of human life under all circumstances. I therefore, in the name of God, disarm John Brown and every slave at the South. But I do not stop there. If I should, I would be a monster. And in the name of God, I therefore disarm every slaveholder and tyrant in the world. I am a non-resistant, and I not only desire, but have labored unremittingly to effect the peaceful abolition of slavery by an appeal to the reason and the conscience of the slaveholder. Yet as a peaceman, an ultra-peaceman, I am prepared to say success to every slave insurrection at the South and in every slave country. Whenever there is a contest between the oppressor and the oppressed, the weapons being equal to both parties, God knows in my heart that my heart must be with the oppressed against the oppressor. Who instigated the deed at Harper's Ferry? The people whose motto is resistance to tyrants is obedience to God, and whose exalting talk is of Bunker Hill and Yorktown. There is a law above all the enactments of human codes, the same throughout the world, the same for all time. It is a law written by the finger of God upon the heart of man, and by that law unchangeable and eternal. While men despise fraud and loathe rapine and abhor blood, they will reject with indignation the wild and guilty fantasy that man can hold property in man. I say, let the will of God be done. That is the essence and the comprehension of all my treason. The will of God be done. We cannot acknowledge allegiance to any human government, and neither can we oppose any such government by force. Our country is the world. Our countrymen, all mankind. We love our country and the land of our nativity as only as we love all other lands. The interests and rights and liberties are no more dear to us than those of the whole human race. Hence, we can allow no appeal to revenge any insult or injury. We register our testimony not only against all wars, but all preparation for war, against every naval ship, against every arsenal, against every fortification, against all militia systems, against standing armies, against military chieftains, against all soldiers, against all monuments commemorative of victory over a fallen foe, all trophies won in battle, all celebrations in honor of military exploits, and against all appropriations for the defense of a nation by force of arms, against every edict of government requiring of its subjects military service. We deem it unlawful to bear arms or to hold a military office. We therefore voluntarily exclude ourselves from every legislative judicial body, and then we repudiate all human government, worldly honors, and stations of authority. I will admit I harbored serious reservations and concerns about the election of Abraham Lincoln to the presidency. Though he did not agree with the extension of slavery, he did not promise to exclude it or to end it in the South or to repeal the fugitive slave law. And then, in an act of great courage, he has issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Grant that there are many sad things to look in the face. Grant the whole of justice has not been done to the Negro. Grievances exist which must yet be addressed. Still looking at the question broadly and philosophically, I think the people will ask one question, and that is whether any of them are within one hair's breadth in advance of Mr. Lincoln. I remember the trials through which he has passed, and I remember the perils that have surrounded him, perils unknown to any man in any age of the world. And I remember how fearfully pro-slavery was the sentiment in the North, and to say nothing of the South. When I remember what he has had to deal with, and then remember that Abraham Lincoln has struck the chains from the limbs of more than 3 million slaves, and he has expressed his desire for the abolition of slavery, and he has recognized the manhood and citizenship of the colored population of our country, I do not feel disposed for one at this occasion or any occasion to say anything against Abraham Lincoln. On February 1st, 1865, the 13th Amendment abolishing involuntary servitude was introduced into Congress. And on February 10th, I spoke to a massive crowd celebrating the Jubilee at the Music Hall in Boston. There are no words to express the emotions of this sublime event. The nation, in rising in the majesty of its moral power, has decreed that liberty be proclaimed throughout the land to all inhabitants. Oh, glory, glory, hallelujah. Amen and amen. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His mercy endureth forever. Let everything that hath breath praise the Lord. No man living better understands the joy, the vastness of the change than I do, but truly, I have no feeling of pride or exultation. God forbid. I am unspeakably happy to believe that this assembly and the mass of my fellow man are now heartily disposed to admit that in seeking by all righteous instrumentalities for more than 30 years the abolition of slavery, I have not acted the part of a madman, a fanatic, an incendiary, a traitor, but at all times have been of sound mind, a true friend of liberty and humanity, animated by the highest patriotism, devoted to the welfare and the peace and the unity and the increasing prosperity and glory of my native land. Thanks unto God, that day is here now. Freedom is triumphant. The people have decreed the death of slavery. All the elements of this country are combined for its immediate extinction. And as Jefferson said in his inaugural, we are all Federalists. We are all Republicans. In the sentiment of the anti-slavery that rules the country now, it may be declared, we are all abolitionists. We are all loyalists. And we are moved by one electric impulse to commemorate a radical change in the Constitution of the United States, so radical that whereas for more than 70 years it served as the bulwark for the defense and the sanction and the security of slavery, it now forbids slavery in every part of our republic. And so we come now to the end of this labor and this holy crusade, and I now close out the last volumes and end publication of The Liberator. It has been, without saying, a total labor of love and commitment for 35 years. I began the publication of The Liberator without a subscriber. And I end it, it gives me satisfaction to say, without a farthing, as the result of the patronage extended to it during 35 years of unremitted labor. No journal has been conducted with such fairness and impartiality. None has vindicated primitive Christianity in spirit and purpose, the higher law over nations, and exerted a higher moral influence upon those who have given it a careful perusal. It has excited the fierce hostility of all that is violent and demonical in the land, but it has won the affection and regard of the very purest and noble of the age. To me, it has been unspeakably cheering, and the richest compensation for whatever peril and danger and suffering and defamation I have been called to encounter. There are those who are expressing deep grief in its discontinuance, which overwhelmingly affects my feelings. Let them feel as I do, comforted by the fact that it merely ends our weekly way of communicating with each other, and not to the high principles that we have espoused or to our hopes and our aims for the future. Most happy am I to be no longer in conflict with my fellow man over the issue of slavery. No man of any refinement or sensibility can be indifferent to the approbation of his fellow man if it be rightly earned. But to obtain it by going along with the multitude to do evil, by pandering to absolute power and corrupt public sentiment, is self-degradation and personal dishonor. Better to be always in a minority of one with God, branded as a madman, fanatic, a heretic, an infidel, frowned upon by the powers that be, and mobbed by the populace, or consigned ignominiously to the gallows like him whose soul goes marching on, or burned to ashes like Wycliffe, or nailed to the cross like him who gave himself to the world. Farewell, tried and faithful patrons. Farewell, generous benefactors, without whose essential contributions the Liberator would have long since been discontinued. Farewell, noble men and women who have fought so long and so successfully under God to break every yoke. Hail, ye ransomed millions! Hail, year of Jubilee! Thank you.
And now our next speaker, John C. Calhoun.
Good morning. I'm happy to see you all out here this morning to listen to this debate on American freedom. Unlike Mr. Garrison, I am not ashamed of my country. I am proud of my country. I do admit that my country, as any country, has made some mistakes. But I also maintain that the mistakes that we have made, that we have always endeavored to overcome them. We may not have been completely successful, but we have created the greatest country ever known to mankind. And I think that history will bear me out. I would like to point out something to you, that one of Mr. Garrison's heroes, John Brown, was a radical, was a zealot, and was a murderer. What he failed to tell you, that before John Brown became quite famous at Harper's Ferry, that he murdered a whole family in the state of Kansas in the name of freedom. I don't think that we need that kind of freedom. Mr. Brown and Mr. Calhoun, Mr. Garrison are radicals. They were zealots. And zealots are the most dangerous people in the world, regardless of their advocacy. My name is John C. Calhoun, and I was born in the Appalachian foothills of South Carolina in the Abbeville district on March 18th in 1782. I would like to give you a little of my background here. I am not here today to defend slavery, because slavery in itself is indefensible. But I would like to go through some of my history of my life to point out to you what I did stand for, and what I, as John C. Calhoun, advocated for the American government. My father, Patrick Calhoun, was an immigrant from Ireland. His family settled in the northwest area of the Carolina colony. This part of the colony was still inhabited by the Oconee and Cherokee Indians at the time. The fame and wealth of South Carolina was in the Tidewater area and in Charleston. Charleston led the colonies in per capita wealth and had the highest growth rate in the Western world. Charleston was the busiest seaport in the American colonies. Now, my father was active in South Carolina politics. He represented what was called the upcountry, which was in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. That area of South Carolina, the people there were looked down upon by the wealthy colonists in Charleston and the Tidewater area. But my father was a man, being Irish, who believed in complete freedom from the government. He disliked even the restrictions that was placed on him or on those of the time of the federal Constitution. I must have inherited some of his desire for freedom, as was shown later in my life. Now, living in this isolated area as I did, education was not readily available. I was largely self-educated until I was 18 years of age. I had only had 2 years at what was called the Log College, which was taught by my brother-in-law, the Reverend Moses Waddell, a Presbyterian minister. I entered Yale University and graduated in 1804. I studied law at Litchfield, Connecticut. I served as a member of the South Carolina legislature in 1808 and 1809. In 1811, I married Floride Calhoun, a distant cousin, who lived in Charleston. Although I was an upcountry man, marriage into this branch of the Calhoun family provided me with entry into South Carolina Plantation Society. The same year of my marriage, I was elected to represent South Carolina in the House of Representatives. Henry Clay from Kentucky was Speaker of the House and leader of a group that was advocating war with England over the interference of American trade with other European countries, especially with France. Many British at the time still looked upon America as a British colony. They were seizing American ships and impressing American seamen who they claimed were British subjects. I was named by Clay to a position on the Committee on Foreign Affairs. As a member of this committee, I supported Clay in the precipitation of the War of 1812. The war lasted until 1815. In 1817, James Monroe, who had served as Secretary of State under Madison, was elected president. I had worked closely with Monroe in the House of Representatives. We subscribed to much the same policies concerning the defense of the country. Therefore, he appointed me Secretary of War. I served in this capacity from 1817 to 1824. John Quincy Adams was elected president in 1824, and I was elected vice president under Adams. At that time, vice presidents were not elected with the president. They ran on their own. Sometimes they were even from different parties. And it wasn't up until 1804, vice presidents did not run as vice presidents. The two highest vote getters in the presidential race was named president and vice president. But the first person elected as a vice president was a man named George Clinton. He was elected to serve with Thomas Jefferson. In 1828, the very popular soldier, Andrew Jackson, was elected president. And again, I was elected vice president. Now, I did not get along very well with the Jackson administration. Jackson was an imperious, inflexible, and an unforgiving person when he perceived that he was being opposed. It was no secret that I had ambitions to be president, but so did Martin Van Buren, who was Jackson's Secretary of State. Van Buren and I were not the best of friends. I thought I had good political support from the southern states and from Jackson because we were both natives of South Carolina. I also had strong support from Pennsylvania. Van Buren set about to undermine me with Jackson by bringing up an old issue that had taken place when I was Secretary of War. Jackson had become Major General of the Tennessee Militia. When the War of 1812 began, he raised 50,000 volunteers from his state, and he was given a command in the field. The enemy whom he marched against was not the British, but the Creek Indians, who were allied with the British and were threatening the southern frontiers. Jackson crushed the Creeks to the extent they were forced to cede to the federal government about 1/5 of the state of Georgia and 3/5 of what later became Alabama. Jackson, without authorization, attacked the Spanish fort at Pensacola, and after the Battle of New Orleans, invaded Florida. This brought protests from Spain and placed the United States in a position of endangerment by retaliation. There was a movement by the Monroe administration to censure Jackson. As Secretary of War, I was involved. But Jackson had become such a hero to the people that it was considered impractical to censure him. Van Buren brought to Jackson's attention my involvement in the incident. This aroused Jackson's ire, and being of the type of temperament he was, this made him a lifelong enemy. Still the hero that he was to the people, especially in the South, when he, through his support to Van Buren, destroyed any chances I had for being nominated for president. Everyone who holds public office creates enemies regardless of how great is his integrity. The one thing that caused more opposition to my policies was the support I gave to nullification. This was an attempt to allow states to nullify any law passed by Congress that they considered unfair and detrimental to their area. At that time, slavery had become a big issue. This was used against me by my opponents as a reason for my support of the Nullification Act. This was completely untrue. My views on slavery had been established in 1812. I wrote an apology for my section's support of slavery. I wrote, "It covers me with confusion to name it here in regard to the compromise in the Constitution permitting the slave trade to continue until 1808. I feel ashamed of such tolerance and take a large part of the disgrace as I represent the Union by whose influence it might be supposed to have been introduced." Mr. Garrison, in his tirade against me, failed to point that out to you. I never was an advocate of slavery. My support for nullification was because of what I and many others in the South considered an unfair export tariff passed by Congress that benefited the northern states and was detrimental to the economy of the South, which was greatly dependent on exports of cotton and other commodities to Europe. The New England manufacturers were not affected by the export tariff because they exported very little abroad, depending on the fast-growing population in the states. The southern economy began to decline while the northern states was enjoyed an increase. I did not believe then, nor do I believe now, that the writers of the Constitution intended for any one area of the Union to profit at the expense of other areas. Nullification was a long and bitter battle which caused a great deal of unrest in the country. At the time, attitudes were more regional than national. Communications were slow, sometimes non-existent. Therefore, the populace was uninformed of happenings outside of their immediate areas. This resulted in much stronger feelings for one state than for the entire nation, much of which they knew very little or nothing at all. The abolition movement had become quite vocal in some of the northern states, especially in New England. This added to the tensions between the North and South. Slavery in America did not originate in the South, as many believe. The British and French and the Dutch introduced slavery in the West Indies, Spain and Portugal in South and Central America, long before the United States existed. Britain brought slaves to North America in the 17th century, first to New England, not to the southern states, because New England was the first to develop. They soon found New England was not well suited for slavery. Those that proved to be adaptable as house servants were kept. And in Mr. Garrison's time, there were still slaves in the New England states. But slavery did exist in the northern states. It was not profitable to keep slaves on the small farms of the north. The larger plantations that began to develop in the South was more suitable for slave labor. After the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, slavery became more progressive in the South. The abolition movement had begun in New England even before the Revolutionary War, but was rather ineffective, as the British paid little attention to the wishes of the colonies. as slavery increased in the South, the abolition movement increased in the North. But not everyone in the North was an abolitionist. And I'm sure that Mr. Garrison will attest to that, because Mr. Garrison himself was attacked by a mob and was severely injured and almost killed and had to be put in jail for his own protection. Now, this did not happen in the South, unless it was South Boston. It happened in the New England states. But similarly, everyone in the South were not in favor of slavery. Only a relative few, approximately 1% or less, that owned slaves, because most of the inhabitants of the South could not afford to own slaves. And those who did not actually suffered under the consequences of slavery. It is quite likely, if it had been decided by ballot, slavery would have been abolished in the South. The resentment in the South was to the tariffs, which eventually led to movements of secession. I was heartily opposed to secession, or disunion, as it was called in those days. I did not support dissolving the Union. I did support nullification as a weapon against tariffs that were detrimental to my state. This, in my opinion, was supported by the 10th Amendment, which states, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited to it by the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. My interpretation of the 10th Amendment is that nullification was legal because there is nothing in the Constitution that opposes it. The first threat of disunion came not from the South, but from New England. This was opposition to a tariff to build roads and canals throughout the nation for defense purposes. New Englanders did not believe they would benefit from these endeavors. Therefore, they objected to being taxed to help pay for them. They threatened to secede from the Union if it became law. The tariff was defeated, and the New Englanders withdrew their support for secession. The differences between myself and the Jackson administration increased over the Nullification Act to the extent that I found it necessary to resign as vice president. I was replaced by Martin Van Buren, who later became president. In 1833, I was again appointed to the U.S. Senate. In those days, senators were not elected. They were appointed by state legislators. I served in the Senate for the next 17 years, except for a brief period in 1844 and 45, when I served as Secretary of State under President Tyler. By 1850, I recognized the North and South were virtually two separate countries, and that only force, military or legal, could compel the North to recognize Southern rights. I did not specifically advocate nullification or states' rights, but I believed the great economic interests could only be safeguarded regionally. And I sought legislation that would restore the lost equilibrium between the two sections. In 1850, I had become ill. I made a last appearance before the Senate. I made this statement in my last speech. The dissolution of the Union is the heaviest blow that can be struck at civilization and representative government. To the end, which came March 31st, 1850, I clung to the Union. Thank you.
Mr. Calhoun once said, "Liberty, then, when forced on a people unfit for it, would instead of a blessing be a curse. It is a great and dangerous error to suppose that all people are equally entitled to liberty." Mr. Calhoun, what did you mean by that statement?
What I meant by that was that liberty was one of the greatest things that people can have. Now, and this, as I stated in my speech, I did not advocate slavery. And I hope you remember that. What I do believe that every person should have liberty, every person should have freedom, and regardless of what Mr. Garrison has told you, I did not support slavery, even though it was an economic possibility in my state of South Carolina and in the other southern states. It contributed to the economy to some extent, but was also an evil thing, and that we admit. But what I meant by liberty was that, as I stated, that I do believe that the Nullification Act, for example, was intended to allow liberty to those who are being oppressed, in their opinion, by the federal government. We have seen this, you have seen this, in evidence in your own state of Idaho, that sometimes, just because a law is passed by the United States government, does not mean that it's a good law. And I feel that there should be some regress for those type of laws, and that is what I had in mind for that.
Thank you. Mr. Garrison.
Well, if I understand that question, and I know that Mr. Calhoun certainly did nothing to enhance the freedom of the millions of people in slavery in the South, and particularly in his own state. And I was of the firm conviction that if we liberated all the African people in our country, and they were born in this country, and they deserved freedom as much, Mr. Calhoun, if not more than all the rest of the citizens of the country. And that if we educated those people, if we freed them, I thought it would take a while to train them, to educate them, to be able to intelligently exercise the franchise and to be able to participate as full citizens in our democracy. But they had the right to an education, and they had the right to be free human beings.
Thank you, Mr. Garrison. First question, I'll bring the mic to you. Just raise your hand, please.
This is directed at Mr. Calhoun. You mentioned that in the early days of the Constitution or our country, that vice presidents were not elected with the president, and then later you discussed that senators were not elected either. Can you update me a little on when our current system evolved in that?
I'm glad you asked that question. I'm sorry I don't exactly have the answer to it, but it was sometime in the late 19th century before they began, and I don't remember the exact date. I'm sorry I don't have the exact date. Before there was an amendment that allowed senators to run for the office the same as the congressman or in the House of Representatives.
Mr. Calhoun, I can assist. It was 1913.
1913.
Yes.
Thank
1913,
you.
we changed to elect the people like the U.S. senators.
Yeah.
Okay. Next question, please.
Mr. Calhoun, I understood you to say that a very small percentage of the Southern people supported the institution of slavery. Why was it that during the Civil War, the Confederate armies were filled with young men from the lower class who presumably were not slave owners?
I would like to point out to you that contrary to the popular belief, the war was not caused by slavery. Slavery did not enter into the secession. The secession was caused by, as I mentioned in my speech, by the tariffs that were passed that was unfair to the economy of the southern states. If you remember, the Emancipation Proclamation was not even passed until 1862-63, and the Emancipation Proclamation, contrary to the popular opinion, did not free the slaves. It only stated that the slaves in the Confederacy would be freed. And frankly, at that time, the United States government had no control over the Confederacy or those states involved. It did not release the slaves in Tennessee, which did not secede from the Union. It did not release the slaves in West Virginia, the western part of Virginia, which later became West Virginia. It allowed them to maintain their slaves, and in states that did not secede from the Union. Does that answer your question, sir?
Mr. Garrison, would you like to respond also?
I believe that Emancipation Proclamation gave the implication that it assumed that it would free all of the slaves. It wasn't applied only to a few states and not to the greater whole of the nation. It assumed that upon the end of hostilities, then further laws would take care of the total abolition of involuntary servitude. So I think that the Emancipation Proclamation was certainly one of the most dynamic and meaningful pronouncements that President Lincoln could issue at that particular period of time to further the hope of all those people in slavery.
I'm hoping that Mr. Garrison will respond first. And my question is, was slavery supported primarily because of economic advantage or primarily because of the illusion of white supremacy?
I think that there was more of an economic support for slavery. The South was benefiting tremendously, particularly from the invention of the cotton gin forward and the tremendous production from the cotton fields and the textile industries and the shipping out of the northeastern ports, Boston and New York, there was a tremendous economic advantage to the north. There's no question about that. History vindicates that. And so there was a tremendous economic support. No one wanted to end the great prosperity they were enjoying, and if there was a movement to do away with the very, very, very cheap labor, it certainly would have a tremendous impact. And, but there was still a great deal of white supremacy, too, given the fact of the terrible treatment of the slaves, and the refusal to allow any of them to enjoy any amount of liberated freedom in the North. As soon as they were able to escape, the fugitive slave laws went back into effect, and whole armies, even in Massachusetts, were raised to bring back one miserable slave. You know, so I think both white supremacy and the economic support for the institution went hand in hand.
Opposition to slavery was profitability. Every country, and slavery goes back to the beginning of time, and every country that ever owned slaves kept slavery as long as it was profitable. As I pointed out in my speech, the New England, where the first slaves were settled, did not oppose slavery at the time, but it was not profitable. And eventually, it is my opinion, that in the southern states, that it would have become unprofitable to own slaves. It was very profitable, and the reason for slavery, for the continuation of slavery after it was sort of abolished in New England, and was that the New England ship owners profited greatly from slavery. It is estimated that they brought over 2 million natives from Africa into the United States. The other industries that supported the shipping industry also profited from it. That's why that the total population of New England did not oppose slavery, but the states as a whole did, because it was not profitable to everyone that was involved. The British, in 1804, abolished slavery from Britain because it had no longer become profitable to them. Because of the one thing that the British shipping industry, that had profited greatly from slave trade, even after it was introduced into the United States, was in competition then with the shipping industry from New England. The colonies that Britain maintained in the West Indies was no longer profitable because they could not control the slaves, because they did not have enough population of English, British there to control them.
Thank you, Mr. Calhoun.
And that was the reason that they abolished it, and that's the reason everybody abolished slavery through time, was because it was no longer profitable.
Thank you.
Mr. Calhoun, you mentioned that you were opposed to slavery, and after hearing what you just said about profitability being its prime reason for having it, I'd like to know if you were opposed to it. Obviously, you weren't opposed to profitability for your state, so it would be on a different level, and so why did you not pursue that with your state and with the southern states?
Well, of course, that's I guess you would say a dichotomy, because frankly, as I stated here, that in 1812, when I wrote this article, that was opposed to slavery as a whole. Slavery had been imposed, more or less imposed upon the states by the British, and it had become a great part of the economy. And again, as I stated in my last statement there, that as long as it's profitable, that no one is going to abolish it. And, of course, even though I personally opposed it, did not mean that my state opposed it. And if I had opposed it, most likely I would not have been called upon to represent my state any longer. And then politics and money always rule over the principles of most politicians. Thank you.
Mr. Garrison.
Well, the fact, Mr. Calhoun, that you saw fit to represent your state certainly attests to the fact of your support for the institution. And I would like to add that about the northern states, by 1808, 12 of the northern states had all abolished, by legislative laws, had abolished slavery. And it had become only an institution of the South. And even if we talk about economic support, certainly that's a very poor rationale to keep people under forced bondage. There can be no moral reason to keep human beings in chains and to deprive them of a normal life, and to sell husband from wife and child from parent. That is, by any standards at any time, that's unimaginable. And yet it was done. Granted, the slave trade had ceased to exist, but slaves were still brought in. And the fact that manumission, allowing slaves to be free and then transporting them to Africa, to Liberia, to set up a free society in Africa, didn't amount to much, because manumission was prohibited and ended in the South. So slavery was certainly an institution that was, by and large, a Southern institution.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce my two friends. They have both been so gracious over the years to perform, and they have moved from what we have on our panels to morning performers. I will first introduce who played John C. Calhoun. Hugh Smith, would you please stand? Would you thank Hugh Smith?
Thank you.
A wonderful story about Hugh. He spent his life working in the shipping industry. Upon retirement, he came to North Idaho and became a student in my class. And I think he was mine in his early 60s. And he was majoring in political science. He received a baccalaureate degree from Lewis Clark State College, a dream he'd always had. And he has performed in the Popcorn Forum for several years, and he and his wife have been dear friends. And he's most famous for Teddy Roosevelt. In fact, he's even been invited a couple of times to go to Wallace, Idaho, where Teddy Roosevelt came in for a tea, and he performed there. And Hugh, we thank you, and why don't you just tell the audience what these characters have meant to you. I know this is a more difficult one today than Teddy Roosevelt.
It is. Teddy Roosevelt was one of my heroes, and that was very easy to follow. I admired him from the time that I can remember when I first started studying about him in history, so I very, very much enjoyed that. I was not all that familiar with John C. Calhoun, although I did remember that I studied him when I was going to school. But I'm pleased that Tony gave me this part because in my research for this, I learned so much about not just John C. Calhoun, but about the country as a whole at the time of this problem and at the time that he was going on. But there is one thing that I really forgot to mention that I would like to bring out, is that in 1832, in the state of South Carolina, there was 450 African slaveholders who had over 1,200 slaves. So slavery, it was not really selected completely by the whites. It was, again, pointing out to you that this was the profit margin that ruled in this case. Yeah. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you very much. And now I want to introduce the gentleman who played William Lloyd Garrison, Ken Palo. Let's thank him. Ken is from Spokane, Washington, and he is an educator. I believe he taught for like 40 years. He says he's retired, but he really isn't. He does many other things. He's played many characters before, including Harry Truman, and he also played John L. Lewis, and we very much enjoyed having him. And by the way, this is very bipartisan. My friend Hugh Smith and his wife have been honored by the Republican Party in Idaho, where they've worked for years. And Ken Palo was the Democratic chair in Spokane County. In fact, he had the honor, under the role of Harry Truman, of introducing Vice President Gore to rally at Gonzaga University. So, Ken, would you like to share with them your experience in these roles?
Well, I have to thank Mr. Stewart for giving me the opportunity to perform here in the Popcorn Forum and to play these different roles, and particularly the role of Harry Truman, who is, of course, one of my great heroes, and John L. Lewis. That pattern of going from Harry Truman to John L. Lewis and now to William Lloyd Garrison keeps within the theme of liberation. Certainly Harry Truman was someone who worked very hard for all of the common people of this country and the working man, and certainly John L. Lewis, with his great leadership of the United Mine Workers and the CIO, helped to liberate the working man, to give him a better standard of living in the 20th century that would not otherwise have been possible. And William Lloyd Garrison, what can you say about him? He was the abolitionist. He had to drag people screaming and hollering to abolition and to bring everything to the attention of the nation and of the government. He wasn't very well liked. He certainly wasn't well liked, but at the end of the Civil War, he was looked upon as the great liberator.
Thank you very much. They both have just been so wonderful and so cooperative. We're having a great week. We thank you for coming. Now, today at 1 o'clock back here in the auditorium, there'll be a very outstanding play. It's about 90 minutes long, and it's in your program. Emily Dickinson is being played by one of our students, and she's done this before, and she's extremely gifted. She'll be on stage without a break, and she'll be in conversation with different people that are not there, but she's pretending they are. And she does all this by memory. She's incredibly gifted. I hope you'll come at 1. And then we have a packed day tomorrow and on Friday. We're so pleased that you're participating in the 32nd year of the Popcorn Forum, and we hope to see you at 1. And thank both of you very much.
Thank you, Tony.